This module will be discussing China. And I'm showing you here a map of China just to give you a sense of bearings as always. And notice India, right, is off to the west. And so we're keeping our spinning globe, right, going eastward as we move along through our cultural discussions. So the name of China, right, originally China was named Zhonggao. And the idea of Zhonggao was the idea of a middle space or middle kingdom, might we say. So this idea of a middle kingdom, middle space. And I think this goes back to the idea that China wanted to say, like so many other cultures, we are the middle of everything, or we are the middle, right, of influence. You see this, with this idea of the axis mundi when you look at the Great Stupa of Sanchi, or you go back to the Persians in Western culture, and they said we're the kings of the universe. So this idea of being in the center of all things means power. Of course, we know it as China, and that name comes from the Emperor Qin, who was considered the first emperor of China. So the name China derives from Qin. And Qin was quite influential in Chinese culture, and of course, we'll visit with him more later on to talk about like the Great Wall of China and his tomb. So these are where, this is the derivative of the name, right? Qin, China, um, and that's where that comes from. The main points that I'm going to use to organize our discussion of historic China are a discussion of religion, because just like with India, I don't think you can really understand the art of China without understanding a bit about the religion, right, that they practice. We'll then move into a discussion of rulership and how rulership affects the kind of monuments that are created. And then finally, we'll discuss the idea of accident and chance. And the discussion of accident and chance is not just a Chinese discussion. To me, it's something you can apply to discussing all Asian cultures who have a great respect for the idea of the unplanned or the accidental, where I believe in Western culture, we really don't. We often get very upset when accidents happen. If we have to sort of revise our plan, we can be a little irritable. So, I think this is a very Eastern way of thinking, and it's a very Asian way of thinking to allow for accident and chance to give you opportunities rather than take opportunities away from you. So we'll finish up our discussion of historic concepts there. Now, thinking about religion, we're going to start off first thinking about the more magical idea of religion. So, as we know it, sort of an unorganized religion. The earliest types of spirituality or divination or magic that were practiced. You'll see a lot of connections back to our African discussion here. Then we'll move into a discussion of what I call the public-private underpinnings of religion and how that helped guide and shape Chinese culture. And then finally, we'll move into a discussion of Buddhism, because Buddhism really is the most prominent religion practiced in China today. But within Buddhism, we also see that a lot of Taoist belief was rolled in. So I'll kind of talk a lot about the progression of religion in China and how they don't usually throw out the old. They find a way often to bring the old beliefs back in, right, and kind of repackage them within the new manner of thinking. So I think it's important to start out thinking about the earliest sort of magical practices and then moving through and looking at how that progression unfolds. Thinking first about magic, right? I'm going to show you some divination objects and also some Shang vessels. Why this picture? This picture is from when I went on an archaeological dig in China as part of my education. I went to the George Washington University in DC for my undergraduate, and my major was, of course, art history, but my minors were religion and archaeology. So during the summer break between junior and senior year, I actually applied to be part of an international group that was going to go to China to work at the Peking Man site. If you know anything about anthropology, early man, Peking Man is considered one of the early man progressions that we see as part of our development. And so people applied from across the country to go on this program, and I was one of the lucky people selected. So I always joke, if you can find me in this photograph, right, I'll give you some extra credit, because I am indeed in this photograph. But part of the fun of going and working on this archaeological dig was not just learning archaeological practice, but getting to spend a lot of time in Chinese culture. And the last 2 weeks of our time in China was traveling around to see various sites in Beijing and Xi'an and different places. And we actually went to this archaeological museum that was very much based around Shang objects. So in the background, you'll notice there's this big vessel behind us in the picture. And this was a Shang ceremonial vessel. And I wanted you to get a sense of the scale and the size of some of these pieces. And you can definitely see it in this photograph. That these were often very, very large, right, ceremonial objects. Now, what were some of these objects used for? They were used for divination and magic and different types of ritualistic purposes. I'll start you off here first thinking about divination by looking at these tortoise shells. And they are what they sound like. They are tortoise shells. And what the shaman would do, or the magical person would do, so think back to Africa and our discussion there, is they would write requests or questions on the tortoiseshell. You'll see the early pictographs, right, the pictograms, right, on the piece, the sort of earliest form of Chinese writing, very different, obviously, than the pictograms or pictographs you see used today. But they would write on the tortoiseshell, and then they would heat the tortoiseshell in the fire, and then they would read the cracks to divine answers. Think back to like the divination practice of throwing the palm nuts and then reading the patterns in Africa. Or later on in this discussion, we'll talk about the I Ching and the idea of reading of patterns there for divination purposes. So again, this is not something unique to this area, but notice that early people, before they had organized religion, this is often something that they practiced, right? That had sort of divinational benefit, right? They felt to the community. Again, you can also look at early Shang bronzes, right, to think a little bit about the use of magic and ritual before they had truly organized religion. The Shang are considered one of the first dynasties of Chinese rulers, but before the proper imperial system, as we would note. But again, these were very important people. This is during what we call the Warring States period, where there wasn't yet unification in China yet, but Shang was, again, a very, very powerful group of rulers. And I wanted you to see the scale of the piece in the photograph because, when you're looking at slides like this, it's a little harder to get scale, or you're seeing, smaller objects. So I wanted you to know they range from smaller objects to really, really large objects. When you look at the bronzes, you'll notice they're covered with this type of kind of stylized imagery or stylized patterning that's on the surface of them. That has this very decorative kind of quality. So when you look at all the Shang vessels, you kind of see the same type of decorative look on a lot of them. And we know that they would drink out of these. They drink, their alcohol. They'd use them for different types of ceremonies and such. And this leads to another fun little story because, they're bronze vessels. They're drinking out of these metal vessels. And so a lot of archaeologists say, well, they must have been giving themselves metal poisoning by drinking out of these. And the Shang are actually known for having rulers that went crazy, that did really nutty stuff. There's supposedly stories of them running through the forests and attacking animals, almost very Dionysian if you know your Greek, stories. But supposedly the Shang, gardens were really fun places. They had lakes of beer, supposedly. So they had these giant lakes filled with beer and different things. But supposedly the party could get really crazy, right, amongst the Shang people, the Shang rulers. But some people think it's because of the metal poisoning that makes you crazy, basically. So again, it's sort of another funny aside about drinking out of a vessel like this, perhaps. Note they'll have purely functional looking vessels, and then they'll have ones that look like animals, and animals that were real animals, and then also animals that ranged more towards the fantastical as well. But again, these are sort of spiritual objects, ritual objects that are outside the sort of boundaries of a true organized religion. And another thing I want to show you with the Shang vessels is the fact that when we excavate burials from the Shang period, we find that very wealthy people or people of status were buried with a lot of these. So it's a way of showing your status, right, or your hierarchy, is to be buried with a lot of the vessels. I bring this up because later when we look at South America, will note that they would denote wealth by the burial of textiles or cloth. So the more textiles you were buried with, the wealthier you were. So here it's vessels, there it was cloth. And of course, you can always go to the Egyptians, who are well known for using burials to show status, right, and wealth. So again, this is why another important reason to think about the use of shang vessels as well. The final object I want to show you is the standing figure that you're seeing here, that uses the shang look, but you'll notice shows a person. And what we found out about this object when archaeologists were working on it, it was originally found broken into pieces, which isn't unusual because if you think about these things being buried and such, a lot of them would get broken, right? And so, especially pottery pieces, obviously the metal pieces were harder to break, but still, you would get often pieces that were broken apart. This is actually a pottery piece, right? So it could be broken easily. But what they found is that it was not broken by accident, it was broken intentionally. Again, you can tell this when you're doing reconstruction of an object. And so they were like, well, why would this be buried? Why would they bury it and then, in a sense, break it? And what they came up with as a theory is that it was this idea of like you could kill a servant, in a sense, to go to the afterlife with a person. So if you were a higher ranking person, maybe you wanted servants in your afterlife. If you look at the Egyptians, for instance, they had these little figures they called Ushapti. They didn't ritualistically kill them, but again, the amount of Ushapti figures in your tomb in Egypt was like the amount of servants you had, so it showed your status. So what we think happened here is that they wanted servants in the afterlife, in a sense, but they didn't want to kill real people. So they would kill these objects ritualistically and then place them into the tomb. This makes a lot of sense because if you look at most cultures, they do not do human sacrifice. So if you've ever heard about human sacrifice, it's very much a myth amongst most culture. The Aztecs, of course, are a real example of human sacrifice, but they're very much an anomaly. Most cultures realize that you don't sacrifice people, it's because that's sacrificing your human capital. You wouldn't do that. So what they would do is do something like this, which was much more ritualistic. The meaning was there, but you didn't have to actually follow through with killing somebody. So, again, it's an interesting way to get around that problem and still have status in your burial.